Welcome, Sean O'Connell. I'd love to have you on. He's a managing editor over at CinemaBlend, and of course, the author of Release the Snyder Cut, the crazy true story behind the fight to save Zack Snyder's Justice League. So, Sean, thank you so much for being on here. It's amazing to have you on, and excited to talk about Justice League and Snyder Cut.
Yeah, of course, Sam. I really appreciate you having me on. Let's dive into it. We're so close to the movie almost being here, which is bizarre to even think about.
I know, it's kind of crazy to even think about how close it is. But before we get into that real quick, I know that you have an Avengers shirt on. And so just real quick, WandaVision is out right now. And I just want to get your quick thoughts on the finale real quick of what you thought about it.
All right. That's why I'm wearing this shirt, is because I do a episode analysis on CinemaBlend's YouTube channel after each episode. And I really thought that the finale was everything that show needed. It brought closure to the story. It buttoned up most of the themes that were happening in it. I think we might have, as a fan base, gotten a little bit ahead of what we were hoping to get out of it. Like, the expectations were soaring in terms of some big reveals and maybe the multiverse and possibly the birth of mutants and all that stuff. But in terms of what it was trying to tell and the amount of stuff that it accomplished in terms of, introducing Sword and the Scarlet Witch and all these amazing things that it pulled off, I'm pretty blown away by Marvel's first attempt at longer form storytelling on Disney+.
Yeah, no, I think they did an amazing job. And I think Elizabeth Olsen definitely deserves some awards consideration of some kind for what she was able to do with that role. It's just outstanding work she did.
It's almost like we took it for granted. From like episode to episode, she was doing something drastically different thanks to the sitcom backgrounds, and she was incredible, just crushed it.
Yeah, she blew my socks off, and I can't wait to see what else Marvel does with Falcon and the Winter Soldier and everything else. It's just, the doors are wide open now, so it's exciting to see what they're able to do next.
For sure.
So I want to now move on to talk about DC, the Snyder Cut. But before that, though, what does it feel like to kind of be in a subject chair? Because I know, being at CinemaBlend, you interview a lot of stars and directors. So what does it feel like to kind of be the person that is answering the questions and being the subject of an interview?
It's super uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. And I don't know, because I don't think of myself as the story, even in this instance, I feel like I'm just sort of the person who passed the bigger story on to everybody else. And there's so much that happened in the Snyder Cut movement and so many more interesting people to talk to. But I guess I do feel pretty lucky that I ended up in the right spot at the right time to ask all the right questions in order to capture this story as it was happening. And, the fact that we're talking about the Snyder Cut movie, the actual movie, coming right behind this book arriving, really made it feel like, I was almost racing the clock to get the story documented so that it would be ready, for people to sort of pick up and flip through and learn about it before the movie hit.
So talking about the book, and we're going to get into May 20th and really kind of the evolution of the book itself and the story. But when you first decided to write this book, what was the original idea for why you wanted to tell this story?
Personally, I wanted to tell the more industry specific side of it. Like, as someone who writes for CinemaBlend and who covered everything happening with the DCU leading up to the release of Justice League, I was really excited to see, the first live action pairing of all these characters, of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. And I was, fascinated to see Zack sort of track it all the way through. I mean, I have 2 Avengers posters over my shoulder. Mm-hmm. The idea of the ensemble comic book movie is very difficult to pull off. And when people do it right, I think it's fascinating. So, there were moments throughout the development of Justice League that, to me, as somebody who loves this industry, was just fascinated by. You never really see a blockbuster director walk away from a film, with months to go before it hits theaters. You never see them get replaced by who at the time, was the person who was directing the rivals' top films. Joss Whedon was directing Marvel films, and he got picked to finish a DC movie, and that blew my mind. So I wanted to kind of pursue that story and almost lay out for everybody what had happened. And you'll read in the book that I got a chance to go to the Justice League set, in 2016 when Zack was still working on it. So I thought I had some inside information, and I knew I had contacts in the industry that I could talk to. But all credit goes to my wife, who really was listening to me pitch this book to her before I started. And she told me that, I understand why you like that, but that's not that interesting to me as a casual person. Like, I more would like to hear who the people are in the Snyder Cut movement and why they're doing it. So she started asking me that. She was like, well, who are they? You know, what's their story? And I had to admit that at the time I had no idea. You know, I said, I really don't know. And I'll start to figure that out. And so I started asking questions on both sides and juggling both sides of those stories, you know, the industry side and the fan base side. And then I kind of married them together into one big book.
Was that what the pitching process was like as well? Because again, we both love movies and we know kind of like what it's like to pitch a movie, an idea for a story on that front. But as a book, was that a tough sell to do as well when pitching it to people to publish this book?
It was. And what I was told by multiple people is that, you know, brace for rejection because, you know, for various reasons, publishers will just tell you that this is not what they're looking for and not to get discouraged in your idea. And, you know, almost it was kind of interesting that the more I got told no, the more I sort of dug my heels in and believed that this was a good story to tell. And then every once in a while you would get somebody who would at least say to you like, yeah, this is a really good idea. Can you get me 3 sample chapters? Or, yeah, you know, can you beef up your outline a little bit? You'd get enough teases that sort of told you like you're on the right path sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I don't like being told no for an answer. So I was pretty bullish about shopping it around. But again, I was totally new to this. I've never wrote a book before, never published a book before. A lot of people were talking to me about doing self-publishing. But I really wanted to try to get a deal with somebody to sort of handle a lot of the distribution and stuff that I didn't think I'd be able to do as well on my own if I didn't have help. So yeah, I just believed in the idea. And I really thought that, you know, the more that things were happening in the Snyder Cut movement, the more that Zack was kind of encouraging them along. I really thought that there's something here and someone was going to pick up on it eventually. And they did. I'm thankful that they did.
Now, one of the things that really popped out to me with the book was just the cover page, the first thing that you see, the cover art. Was that something that you came up with or designed, or was that somebody else that came up with it? What was that process like to really put something together that really fit the mold of what a DC comic even looks like with that cover page?
So the cover design is by a guy named Nick Ingram, who is just an artist in the Snyder Cut movement. And
oh, wow.
The only contribution that I have to it is that I love the Art Deco style. When he and I talked, I was giving him, well, I think I put, this was a while ago now. I threw it out there to almost anybody in the movement who wanted to submit ideas to me. I kind of said, there were a lot of points throughout the course of this putting this book together where I wanted contributions from the movement as much as I could. And the cover art became a really great way for me to say, like, there's extremely talented people in the movement. If anybody wants to come up with a cover for me, please do so. And I had a bunch of great people who submitted really interesting ideas. This was kind of around the time that the official Snyder Cut Twitter account was doing a poster design contest as it was. So everybody kind of had their creative juices flowing. And when Nick and I worked together, I basically just told him how much I loved these posters that were from the World's Fairs back in the 30s and 40s. You'd see like Chicago and San Francisco and these, you know, cities of tomorrow would be the way that they advertised them. And it had this very bold, very striking, you know, hard lines and vivid colors. And he came back to me with that design. And we tweaked a couple of things here and there. We added some color to the silhouettes of the characters. But his design with the building and the sunbursts coming out from, which to me also looks to be like if you're at a movie premiere and the spotlights are going through the sky. There are a lot of elements about it that I loved. And of course, when you're a book, you know, you're on the shelf, you want to sort of stand out from everybody else. And his one just caught my eye, man. I thought he did an amazing job.
No, it was absolutely amazing. He covers all the heroes really nicely. I thought it was an outstanding job. So give him my props for the art that he's able to do. Now, I want to move on to May 20th, 2020, and really kind of the day that shook everything up in terms of Justice League and the Snyder Cut. And for you with the book, how much evolved from the inception point of wanting to tell this story and seeing that kind of resolution happen with the announcement of this actually coming to light? Did you have to do like a complete 180 change on the book, or was it just easy additions, extra chapters? What was that like once that announcement was made by Zack on May 20th?
It's a tremendous question. There were multiple times throughout the course of writing this that I had to decide how the book was going to end or function if the cut was never announced, right? Like, and I figured that the tone of the book and the time period covered in the book would essentially say, these were the people in the immediate years after, the release of Justice League in 2017 who lobbied really hard to change the minds of the studio. But in the back of my mind, I always thought it was going to be a bit of a Richard Donner type situation where it would take almost 2 decades to get this cut out, and was not prepared for it to happen as quickly as it did. So I had an idea in mind for the end of the book where I was going to turn it over to the fans from the movement and basically let them send a message to Zack, on the off chance that he picks up this book. And they did. They submitted, everybody submitted ideas from all corners of the globe, messages of support and just passionate connection to Zack. And they're still in the book. I left them there. That's how the book was going to end. So thankfully, when he announced the cut, it did 2 things. One, it gave the book a much better ending. But I didn't have to drastically change too much because the story of how we got there was still the story. And so I was lucky that I structured it in a way that it wasn't overly reliant on the cut coming or not coming. And so I changed the beginning, I changed the ending, and then tweaked a few things throughout the course of it. But really, the amount of things that they had accomplished in order to get to the point where the cut got released were still sort of set in stone. And I ripped out my whole first chapter because then I ended up getting an interview with Zack post May 20th, which allowed me to then build a better opening, and it also allowed me to string in. There were a lot of moments in the book where I was either relying on secondhand reporting or coming to conclusions on certain things that he was able to either confirm for me or give me a better anecdote, that filled in the gaps of that. So it strengthened, and basically throughout the course of the book, it just sort of strengthened the story all the way through, but the bones of it were there.
And you talk about this actually getting to speak with Zack Snyder, and I don't want to kind of give anything away that's in the book, but in the beginning, you talk about this, I think, a awesome story of how you were able to kind of talk about everything happening for a reason. And I'll just kind of leave it there. But getting to interview Zack, what was that like? And to talk to him about finally able to complete this chapter in his life and fulfill the vision that he's always wanted to do with Justice League.
I didn't want to say it out loud at any point over the course of it, but if I didn't get him for it, the book would have been incomplete. Like it would have felt like good effort, but
right.
You didn't really get it. So him coming on record and giving me an interview, knowing that it was specifically for this book, because there are other elements in the book where I have interviews from him from the Justice League set. I have interviews from him from when I was able to go to the set of Army of the Dead. And in each of those cases, he does discuss, first on the Justice League set, he talks about his vision for what that movie would have been. And on the Army of the Dead set, he opens up a lot about his opinions of the movement and the work that they were doing. But those weren't interviews that I got specifically with the book in mind. They're just ones that I had. So I really did want to get them after the fact. And so, yeah, that meant everything to me. And it was just cathartic. It was cathartic to be able to catch up with him after the fact and to just get his opinions on how he felt being able to reveal this. What people don't realize too is that this book had to be turned in last July. It's now March, because the publishing process takes far longer than I had ever anticipated. As someone who writes for the web, I'm used to the immediacy of just publishing what you write. But there's a whole process that goes into place in terms of editing and layout and design, and then publishers choosing when on the calendar they're going to release the book. So it's good that the story here that's contained has a finite, almost an ending to it, which is the May 20th reveal and a little bit of a victory lap after the case. But there's so much stuff that has happened in the movement from fandom and JusticeCon and, the elements that he's included from the additional photography. There's so much more that you could cover. But this is truly just about, the time leading up to the release and a few days after.
Now, talking to the fan base, and you've done it for a long time throughout the last few years, what is it like to have ingratiated yourself with them? And have you learned anything new while covering this book in regards to the release of Snyder Cut fan base?
That's fascinating. I'm not quite sure that I have ingratiated myself with the fan base. It's some people still consider me an outsider and someone who hopped on the bandwagon, and some people give me credit for giving it a spotlight. It cements my belief that a fandom is a very fluid and unpredictable thing, and I'm still, I will forever be gobsmacked by the fact that this movement held themselves together for the majority of the time for 3 long years, and kept their eye on the prize, because you're seeing it now as we get closer to the release of the movie that fan bases by definition they fracture. They find things to fight about. They get super passionate about one thing and they argue about other things. And the Snyder Cut movement, as opposed to plenty of other fan bases who look for things to fight about, at least had enough leadership at the top to keep them organized and dreaming big, and planning and motivating for a lot of these marketing campaigns. But it's been really interesting to see. I've said this once or twice, in other interviews, and I do believe this. If they had to keep going for like 1 more year in order to convince Warner Brothers, I'm not quite sure they would have gotten there.
Oh, really? You don't think so?
Well, they just feel like they're teetering on the precipice of, tearing themselves apart at any given time. And they had a couple of really big wins, including that November 17th, 2019 trending event, that Toby Emmerich points at as saying like that was the moment where we just couldn't. There's an element of the fact that they were constantly going to be wearing Warner Brothers down by attacking them on social media and making their voices heard. And there's definitely an element of Warner Brothers finally just waving the white flag and saying we have to come up with some way to make you guys stop. But I don't know how many more, because even with some of the marketing events that they tried to do in the last few days of it, the digital billboard during the FA Cup, and there was another one too where they were arguing about like some of the t-shirt campaigns and things like who should do what and what's more valuable. You started to see some of those arguments bubble up and almost start to overwhelm the impact of what they were doing as a group. And so I honestly do think if they had to do it for another year, I'm not quite sure that they would have been as successful.
Now you talk about the glue and sticking together. Have you ever seen a director and a fan base kind of be in tandem with one another, where the director responds to the fan base and they kind of have this relationship in a way? Because I personally have never seen that before in terms of these big comic book movie adaptations. I mean, the Russo brothers put out some stuff here and there, but they don't have that kind of link with the fans like Zack Snyder, I think, really does with his fans and what he's done with the Snyder Cut over the last few years.
No, I don't think anyone else really does. And I honestly didn't know that Zack had this level of dedication before all of this. I guess you could chalk up a Tarantino. He might be the closest of a fan base that's going to come out to see his movies. But you're right with the Russos, like the majority of that audience is still coming out for the brand. Same with Star Wars. Like Abrams has an audience, Rian Johnson has an audience, but nobody came out to those movies largely because of them, sort of thing. With Zack, it's not just the DC movies, but it's him also. And I found that, the movement kind of fractures pretty evenly amongst people who are DC fans, people who are Snyder fans, and people who are interested in the mental health awareness of the campaign. And I'm not sure which one of those pieces of the pie would be larger. I think there are just as many people who are in this because they love DC as they are in it for they love Snyder's interpretation. And almost everybody buys into the notion that they're doing really positive things for mental health. If it wasn't Zack who was in this position, if it was Patty Jenkins or David Sandberg, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. I don't think fans would be arguing to see their cut of whatever movie got compromised. But the fact that it was Zack kind of bit Warner Brothers in the ass as they tried to hold off the fan base.
Now, I want to kind of talk about that, about really biting them in the ass a little bit and talk about kind of some of the behind the scenes details. Why did this really blow up in Warner Brothers and DC's faces? Like, how did it get this bad for them in terms of 2017, 2016, the fallout of BVS? How did it really get to that point, and why did it get to that point?
I mean, so many factors. And, you can look back on it in hindsight and really try to say, like, I can't believe that they let this happen. But there's a bunch of decisions that they made that if they worked, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If, let's just say Whedon's reshoots made the theatrical cut watchable, like not great by any stretch, but if the majority of the fans went and watched it and they were like, all right, it wasn't Zack's vision, but it wasn't terrible,
Mm-hmm.
It's like it was Ant-Man or it was Shazam,
right.
The fact that so Warner Brothers rolled the dice and took a gamble and hoped that they could put out something that the fans would at least find acceptable, instead of offensive. I think that would cut this off at the pass, and Warner Brothers wouldn't even be worried about it. I still think, in hindsight, that if the 2017 cut had Joss Whedon's name in the credits and not Zack Snyder's, Warner Brothers might have avoided a lot of this as well too. I think that was a huge slap in the face for the people who were dedicated to Zack, to almost say, like, you took this movie away from him, you completely changed the way it looks, and you put his name on it.
Yeah.
Forget that. I'm going after you that way. So those are some of the things that, like, in hindsight, had they broke a different way, Warner Brothers might not look like, quite the enemy for the decisions they made back in that day. I don't know. It's such a fascinating confluence of things that went wrong. And another huge thing is just, there's so many other directors who might have just decided that it wasn't a fight worth fighting, that the opportunity passed and they weren't going to be able to finish their movie. It is what it is, but Zack was going to move on to, greener pastures and really focus his creative attentions on something else. And I've said this a lot, he alone had the ability to turn around to the fans and say to them, like, I love what you guys are doing and I truly admire it. Thank you for everything, but I'm moving on. And he never did. He always kept them going. And it takes a filmmaker like that to keep stirring that pot the way that he did. And we wouldn't be here now if he didn't do that too.
I found an interesting chapter that you have in the book talking about Nolan. And I think that his presence kind of loomed large in the DCU a lot longer than I think people realized. And I think you talk about that a lot in the book. Do you think that the shadow of Nolan maybe loomed too large in the sense that the studio wanted to keep going this dark, gritty route off the success of the Dark Knight trilogy? Do you think that the Nolan aspect is a lot larger than people maybe realize it was?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I just revisited Man of Steel with a friend of mine, Paul, who used to run Joe Blow, and he and I kind of came up with this conclusion that Warner Brothers has always been reactionary, instead of leading with a vision. And by that I mean, Man of Steel was them chasing after what had happened with The Dark Knight, with Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and wanting to replicate that success, but do it with Superman. And because Nolan was standing up for Zack and supporting him, Zack got the ability to do what he wanted largely on that picture. And that's why you got heavy sci-fi Krypton, and a lot of the other elements that would seem a little bit crazy for people who are coming into a Superman film. But Zack was able to take big swings for it. With BVS at that point then too, Zack is continuing his narrative, but the studio stops backing it quite as much. They're starting to again react to the overall, mainstream response of just like, this is too dark, this is too serious. And they have an eye, Warner Brothers, I think, has an eye across the street at Marvel and saying, oh, they're a little bit lighter, they're a little bit more audience friendly. Why don't we go chasing after that instead of committing to the vision that you had? So I think Nolan bought Snyder a lot of freedom early on, but he wasn't able to sort of keep the studio wolves at bay as the series progressed. They constantly wanted to try to change gears and go in a different direction and get back to something that was a little bit more Marvel similar. And I think that's why they hired Whedon in the first place.
Now, first off, thank you so much for being on here. I just have a few more questions for you about this. But one thing that I really thought was amazing was this Vanity Fair article that came out. And I think it coincides really well with your piece on the release of Snyder Cut. And they really dive into this one aspect that I think hasn't really been talked about a whole lot, and that's Autumn Snyder. How big of an impact do you think Autumn Snyder has had, or her presence looms over this entire story, from the actual film, from the Snyder Cut, from the release of Snyder Cut movement? Because I feel like she's really the centerpiece of this entire story, really.
she's a huge component of it. And personally, my take on it is really torn, because it's hard to talk about what happened with Zack, and why he left the project. And it's hard to talk about the amount of work that the Snyder Cut movement has done without referencing her, obviously. But as a parent of two boys myself, I always find it uncomfortable to refer to the story of the death of a child with relation to any movie, because to me, I just don't think they belong in the same conversation. So that was a really difficult chapter to write, because in no way did I ever want to minimize or trivialize or try to make a connection to the loss of a child and a superhero movie. Like they don't exist in the same conversation. But it's impossible not to mention, her loss, the suicide, and the impact that it had. First, negatively, obviously, because Zack had to walk away from this vision that he'd committed years of his life to. And that's not something that you can predict. It's one of those left turns that life throws at you, that if something were to happen a year from now, I couldn't tell you today, that it was going to derail me quite that well. But the positive end of it ends up becoming the motivation that it gave the Snyder Cut movement, that if they were only fighting for a movie, I don't know if that would have been strong motivation enough to keep them going for this amount of time. It almost became this badge of honor of the amount of money that they were raising for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It almost became, and when they get criticized for it, they get told like, oh, you guys are only doing that so that you can wave that around as a banner, for people who call you toxic. Sure, there's an element of that, but they're raising money for suicide prevention. And there's just like when Zack cuts, anytime he talks about it, he cuts right to the heart of it. And he says that money is helping to save lives. And you can't question that. That's 100% true. So I love that the movement has that positive element to it. I love that aspect of it has encouraged many people to stay invested in the fight, because they know that at the same time, not only are they lobbying for the Justice League movie that they want to see, but they're doing something good to help other people, and the mental health awareness is important to that. However, I mean, I wish that they never had to have that aspect of the story, because it would mean that Autumn, never died. So.
Right. No, absolutely. And just a few more questions that I have. What are your expectations for Justice League kind of moving forward? We're only a week really or so away from it. What are you most looking forward to with Justice League, and what do you hope to see in the film?
I can't believe that it's going to be like, not only is he getting to release his cut of it, but it's the unfiltered, complete raw vision at 4 hours.
That's crazy.
I would like to have a conversation with him to almost ask, like, if he had to prepare, like, if it came out in theaters in 2017, it probably would have been closer to like 2 hours, 45 minutes. Wow. Maybe he would have got Warner Brothers up to 3 hours, but a 3-hour cut released anywhere is really hard.
Yeah.
And so I want to know what that additional hour is going to be. When you talk about just like, I mean, you're essentially getting 2 movies. You're getting the length of 2 movies. So even if it follows, in the loosest sense, the beats of the story that we saw play out in theatrical, and I think it's going to, I think that you've seen the outline, essentially. Bruce having to put the team together, Steppenwolf coming to retrieve the mother boxes, all those elements are there. But at 4 hours, the way that it's able to breathe, it's going to be so much more character development. It's going to be so much more, even just like longer sequences or longer cuts of the scenes that we saw play out. And just like the more adult version of it. Like, I cannot wait to see. I also think I think there's a ton of surprises, and it's not even just the Joker additional photography. I think that there's so much stuff with Flash, with Cyborg, with Batman, with the resurrection of Superman, and additional scenes that are going to come with Superman that we didn't get to see in theatrical cut. So much more than I anticipate, and I just can't wait to really lose myself in it. I almost like, as much as I want to see it theatrically too, as much as I think it's sort of designed to be shown in a theater, when it's on the streaming service and the ability that, like, once it's over, you could just start it over again, blows my mind. Like, in a given weekend, I could try to watch it 3 times if I want to. And that's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
The fact that I'm going to be able to watch that and then Falcon and Winter Soldier and then just go right back to it during the weekend is just going to be amazing to kind of experience.
It'll always be ours. It'll always be there now. Just waiting.
Exactly. Now, the one thing that I am a little worried about, and I think this is a question that a lot of people are going to have theoretically moving forward, is the fact that Zach has said, he said at IGN Fan Fest, that this is going to end on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And do you think that with the fan fervor that's going on right now, there's now the hashtag of restore the Snyderverse. Do you think that maybe, he's even said that I don't think I'm going to be able to get the chance, but do you think that if there's enough of an encouragement by Warner Media, HBO Max, this isn't at Warner Brothers Pictures anymore, can we get more Zack Snyder films? Because we also have to think about Ben Affleck and the cast. Is it possible that if this is well received, we could get that in the future?
It's so easy to make a case for either side, and that's what's frustrating about it. Streaming services need content, and they have pretty deep pockets to invest in this content. It would make a lot of sense for them to invest in a proven brand, not just DC, but Snyder himself. So I can understand that if it does well, and if it drives up subscribers, and if it gets the type of attention that they want it to get, that they would very easily greenlight it. The only thing that holds me up, and what makes you be able to make a case for the argument side of it, is just the technical aspects of getting that cast back together, and putting back together. It almost feels like it would be easier for him to do a DC tied project that's not a Justice League film, that isn't that vision of the next two films that he wanted to do, as tantalizing as that seems, because I just don't know how you juggle everyone's schedules on the budget or time constraints of an HBO show. It almost feels like he could get back together with Ben to do that Batman show that he wants to do, but logistics of putting together a full-on, like, these are massive productions, you know, and it's real easy for fans just to say, just do it, but it's really hard. It's really hard to pull that off.
I mean, $70 million just to finish this up. $70 million. That for some mid-budget films, that's like a whole movie for them.
So I know that he has discussed, doing it in graphic novel form, and maybe that's a possibility. I also do think that, like, doing it in animated form is a way to do it as well too. Continues his story, allows the actors to do voice work potentially for their characters, which is much easier for them to do than committing to live action. So I'm optimistic, but I when you look at the realism of mounting a production of that size, they can do it. They can figure out a way to do it if they want to, but I think that's a pretty daunting ask.
So to wrap up here, I have one big question when it comes to tying it back to the book. You talked about, I listened and saw a interview that you did with Perry Nemiroff a few months ago, and you're talking about not wanting to do a book again that has a lot of breaking news issues, because this was something that was always going forth and had so many different updates going on. Would you want to do a book in the future, and would you ever tackle something with this kind of breaking news element? And what was that like, tackling it with so many different updates?
It was much harder than I thought, because I didn't think about it at the time. I'd never written a book. I'd never realized how much you need to really hunker down and do the research and get all your facts and elements right, and wanting to expand on it. And the fact that this story was ever changing made that frustrating, because you want to kind of cement your chapters and have them done, and you don't want to be moving things around constantly, and certain chapters shouldn't be affected by other things. I absolutely want to write another book. I'm actually working on another book right now, and it's tied to the history of Spider-Man and his journey through Hollywood, and it's a little bit more finite, because I can at least just go back over through the Raimi films and the Mark Webb films, and build on the MCU and some of the stuff that Sony is doing. And there's a little bit of what's going to happen with Spider-Man 3, but for the most part, the story has been told. I do entertain the idea of going back into and doing a follow-up to this Snyder Cut book, and almost getting into whether the Snyderverse gets restored. But I think one of the huge lessons that I learned is let the story play out first, and then come back around to it and try to tell it from the perspective of somebody who lived through the course of this. Because while I think I was able to stay up to date with it, there's plenty of other elements to the story that I would love to have included in this book, and the time frame and the deadlines of it just didn't warrant it. So I didn't notice it at the time because I was just busy writing it and having a really good time doing it. But now in hindsight, that's a crazy way to try to put a book together.
And I don't know if you would be able to drop an exclusive tidbit, but do you know when you might be able to have that Spider-Man book out, or is it just still in the process of being made and there's no release date for it yet?
No. It's due to my publisher. I'm staying with the same publisher. I'm staying with Applause.
Okay.
The book is called With Great Power. It basically is going to tell, in my opinion, by 2019, Spider-Man had become the most powerful and influential comic book superhero character during what I consider to be the golden age of comic book movies, with the Oscar win for Into the Spider-Verse, him being part of Avengers Endgame, which is now the highest grossing movie of all time. Far From Home crosses $1 billion. Sony and Disney continued to ink their deal that allows him to be shared between multiple studios. All the development of Sony television that they're doing with Spider-Man characters, Venom and Morbius, and the Sony, there's no other character that I think touches what he's been able to accomplish. And so I'm spending this entire year of 2021 collecting all the research and speaking to everybody who's ever been involved with the Spider-Man franchises over the years. And I have to deliver it to them by January of 2022 with the intention of getting it out potentially by October of 2022. So maybe it will drop right around the time that Into the Spider-Verse Part 2 hits.
Well, I definitely will be picking that up, especially after release the Snyder Cut. So
Thanks,
one more question to wrap up here, Sean, then I'll let you go. Thank you so much for being here for as long as I've had you on.
Great questions, man. These are great questions.
Thank you. So when looking at this entire story, and this story is still ongoing. I mean, we have everything going on with Ray Fisher, Josh Whedon, and that whole thing. And obviously with everything releasing now with the Snyder Cut on March 18th. But to kind of, if you were to put it all together, what are 5 words or names that you would drop to people that don't know anything about this story at all, and that you would say these are the 5 words or the 5 names together that are most important when it comes to talking about the entire story regarding Zack Snyder, Justice League, and his in that era of DC?
Wow. Artistic integrity, suicide prevention. Those are 2 huge terms in terms of motivation for this, and just resiliency. I'm going to throw resiliency out as my 5th word, because there's no quit in this fan base at all. So many people turned around and told them why they should stop fighting for something that quote unquote doesn't exist, and they were the most resilient I've ever seen any fan base be. And I'm not quite sure that another fan base would come close to this. And so that's always been sort of unprecedented, and has really blown my mind about how resilient they've been. And why they were resilient for 2 main reasons: artistic integrity, standing up for Zack, standing up for the movie that they believed in, and suicide prevention, which became, something, a cause that was near and dear to their hearts and really became a rallying cry for everybody.
Well, we'll definitely take that with us as we get ready for March 18th. Sean O'Connell, thank you so much for being on the Sam Bussell Podcast. And maybe we can have you on after March 18th and talk actually about the film itself and what we all thought about it. I'd love to have you back on to talk about that. Once again, Sean O'Connell, managing editor over at CinemaBlend and the author of Release the Snyder Cut, the crazy true story behind the fight that saved Zack Snyder's Justice League. Sean O'Connell, once again, thank you so much for being on the Sam Bussell Podcast, and enjoy the movie. And we hope to have you back on soon to talk about it in the future.
Thank you, Sam. Great show. Keep it up.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.